Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Podcana. I'm joined by Moyen today to break down the top four deck lists from the recent Lorcana Challenge in Chicago. Moyen, I know you were able to catch some of the coverage, and you're doing a co-stream with Spessy. How did it go? What did you think of the production, and what did you think of the gameplay ultimately? Going into this tournament, there's a large rhetoric or large narrative around Bucky. People really thought Green Steel was going to show up, that was going to dominate, and it did do that. But do you think it was as powerful and as broken as everybody's seeing? I use the word broken specifically because people were really calling for Bucky to be banned in the lead up to this tournament.
Uh, I do think both Sapphire decks have a completely fair shot against it. It's just it might be a bit limiting to what type of decks you can play without getting destroyed by Bucky. I think the production was fine. I think the gameplay was mostly good from what I could tell. You can't always see the entirety of their hand of the cards in their hand at each point in time. So you can't like hyper analyze every micro decision, but there was some very impressive gameplay that I've witnessed.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, we're gonna dive into those lists, starting off with Green Steel here. One thing I want to mention is we did do a metagame prediction on the Podcana channel. We did a tier list video. We are pretty much 100% right. So in order, ascending, ascending to descending, whatever, top to bottom. Ruby Sapphire 23 into the top 64, Green Steel 13, Blue Steel 9, Ruby Amethyst 8. Those are the decks we put into S tier. In A tier, we had Emerald, Amethyst, and there was two. In B tier, we had Ruby, Amber, and Amber Steel, and there was two represented for each of those. And then in C tier, we had Amber, Emerald, and Amethyst Steel, and there was one of each of those. And then all the decks we put in unplayable were not represented. As far as we
That
understand the
that
data, that's how it broke down.
yeah, that being said, I think from this breakdown there's three decks missing where we didn't really know the deck list. But other than these three decks, this is the exact breakdown, which is completely representative of the tier list, which I think I think is absolutely crazy that that happened.
Yeah, which I have to say, I guess we are not surprised. I could have seen more Green Steel make it in a top 64. I was surprised with just 13. And again, we could be plus or minus three decks on that. I was surprised with just 13. I did think that, Sapphire Ruby was a really well positioned deck, but in my opinion, looking at the data, it did overperform. Anyway, we'll get into the specifics of the list for something like Amber, Ruby, Sapphire soon. But let's go ahead and jump into this Green Steel list. Is there anything that stands out to you immediately, like just jumps out to you about this list? There's two cards in particular that for me, where I've seen them played in Green Steel, but they weren't. They probably weren't the first inclusions on everybody's list on the day.
Um, yeah, I think the ones you're talking about are probably the Flynn Riders, which have made a couple appearances in the top cut on the streamed games that I've seen, and they performed extremely well. They basically Because Emerald Steel is really good at getting card advantage and winning the board, but then sometimes it can take them a couple too many turns to actually lure to 20, and Flynn deals with that problem really well while being able to contest opposing Diablos. Um, so I think it's been an absolute MVP in the games that I've seen from Emerald Steel.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the location, the cove specifically? We've seen that be utilized to dodge some of this targeted removal in the format that targets characters based off their attack power, and the cove allows you to bump the attack power of some of those characters and avoid some of that removal. How did you see that performing on the weekend?
Um, it was decent. I didn't see it break the games like it has the potential to. So I'm sitting a bit on the fence about it. The times where you do go um early shift Diablo and the only removal is like a brawl or a boom and then you just put it at 3 willpower of the cove. Those are the times you're really playing this card for. The big cost of playing this card is that it is not a great draw later in the game. Um, when you have little characters on the board. So I still think there's some value in it. I guess the exact card count of how many you want to play still has to be figured out.
Yeah. And talking about the specifics of the rest of the list, like what cards are making into this list that maybe differentiate from your Green Steel list? I know that you previously had been playing some Pegasus with the shift package, and surely that did show up on the day. There's also Top and Tinkerbell that hasn't been included. What do you think about some of the other inclusions here?
I was always an advocate for not playing Pegasus, which was like the big standout for my
Mm-hmm.
Emerald Steel list. So um, I like that there's no Pegasus. I'm not saying Pegasus is bad, but I think you can do better things if you're not including it. And usually what we've seen is either you play the Flynn Rider package or the Pegasus package in a lot of these lists. The other thing is, okay, not everyone was actually playing Ursula Deceiver of all. So then the action package, they're a little bit split on their removals. It's one Baboom, one Zeus, three Sudden Chill for the Ursula. There's some interesting choices, but overall I think this deck's like very well rounded, and I like the way it's built.
Do you think those Flynn Riders will scale well into the metagame post Chicago, or do you think that other decks will opt to respond and it might lose some of that efficacy?
I think it's a card that's very tough to respond to in conjunction with the Bucky. So probably the meta will adapt. I just don't know how it will adapt yet. Also, I guess one thing that I I I generally like to play more than two Bruno. I'm usually on 3 or 4, so that's one card that maybe I would personally increase the count of.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this deck did end up winning the tournament, took the whole thing down, and like I mentioned, was one of the favorite decks going into the weekend. How do you feel sort of post event? Would you be comfortable saying Green Steel best deck, or do you think that it is just kind of up there in power level with the other top four decks in the form of Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire, and of course that Emerald Amethyst?
Um, for me, it's difficult to say. Like the bulk of Emerald Steel is not the best deck in the game, but something closer to how this Emerald Steel is built might be might really be the best deck in the game. This deck, even I think the best decks into this deck would be Sapphire Steel and also Ruby Sapphire. But even those matchups are so close that it barely has weaknesses.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's hop on to our next list, which is going to be Emerald, Emerald Amethyst, a deck list that I think was not getting a lot of talk going into the tournament. Only put two into the top eight. Only ultimately, sorry, in the top 64, and then put one into the top four. This is a deck that we put. I felt like we took a risk when we put in A tier. We only had one deck in A tier. We had four decks in S tier, one deck in A tier, and everything else was below. And we talked about this huge gap. We're like, the gap between S tier and the next best deck is huge. But we're like, we're gonna take a risk. We're gonna take a risk on Emerald Amethyst, and we decided to put that in A tier, and it ended up doing its job on the day. How do you feel about this deck?
Um, it got me thinking again. This performance getting second with this list. I think it's the best deck we have in the meta against Ruby Sapphire. The Merfolk into either Flynn or Ursula opening with the Amethyst card draw and gold late game with and cast sets is like everything you would want to do against that specific deck. That being said, oh, I think Ruby Amethyst is also a good matchup, and the way they built this deck, I think they're doing a lot of things right, taking advantage of the 2-cost Ursula Deceiver being left on the board with the Shift Ursula. I think the Jug giving Reckless to potential Diablos is a nice inclusion as well, and I think even when you drop Ursula, which I think is good, at Ursula Deceiver of all, I think you still want a few copies of Mother Knows Best, which they agree on because the tempo swing can be absolutely massive and necessary for this deck to function even without the Ursula Deceiver of all. That being said, I do still think it will struggle against both Emerald Steel and Sapphire Steel too much for me to really um, say that we would have undervalued this deck. But I think we placed it well in 8 tier.
Yeah, this is a deck that I could see rising in popularity due to sort of getting the coverage it did on the weekend. It is a deck that everybody did, I think people knew it was powerful, but they just kind of forgotten about it a little bit. And also in this heavy steel meta, it had the metagame conditions just didn't seem fantastic for it at the time. Nevertheless, I mean, this deck showed up to a tournament that had a lot of steel in it. And this is, pre top 64 cut, and it was able to do the job. So I think it was a great metagame pick for the tournament. And like you mentioned, the matchup into Ruby Sapphire is almost unparalleled. Ruby Sapphire really struggles with those sort of turn one merfolks, like those very aggressive early curves with the two questers. Very hard for Ruby Sapphire to deal with. So I'm happy to see that it made it to the top four here. And it's a list that I definitely have on my radar for set championships. I know you probably do as well, because this is actually a deck that you brought to Lille in the set three metagame.
Yeah, I love this deck. I have a soft spot in it in my heart, and I think it was an incredibly good deck in set 3, but I think it's fallen off a slight bit.
Mm-hmm. All right, so hopping on to our next deck, we have Ruby Sapphire. A list that looks very close to the list that you made rank 1 with. I know it probably has some controversial cuts. One card that I want to point out is the Inkable Sisu at 3, the 2 copy. There's one big takeaway I had from the weekend in regards to the set 4 metagame. I feel like there are a lot of lists in the set 4 metagame. A lot of the most popular decks are very weak to the Queen's Castle, the 4-cost location in Amethyst. One thing that can help you deal with that in Ruby Sapphire is that 3-cost Inkable Sisu, and it does correlate with your core game plan of potentially being able to shift out the 8-cost later if necessary. Moyen, how do you feel about this list overall? And talk to me about the few changes that were made that are different from your list.
Of course, for me, it's very difficult to judge a deck if it's like 2 cards off my list on the deck that I played the most. So the easiest thing to say is, okay, just revert those changes. But I think the inclusion of the two great stone dragons that I wasn't playing is very interesting in an attempt to counter the emerald discard, where you can just ink off your discard pile instead when they make you discard your hand. But the controversial cuts are the 4th Fargo and the 4th Quill. I don't think I would be cutting those even if I wanted to fit in the 2 Great Stone Dragon. But it is a very tight list, and I can understand it. It is tough to fit something like that in. And I didn't get to see lots of the Great Stone Dragon in action on stream, and I'm interested to know how well it performed over the entirety of the tournament for them.
Yeah, I saw a lot of talk about this card in lead up to the tournament. People talking about it countering Green Steel. I don't think it does that. I do think it is a good card versus Green Steel. It's also inkable. That being said, you really need to drop it on curve. And does it really? I don't know. Is it a counter card? No. Yeah, it is just a value-oriented card in that matchup.
Also, it's not like even in that matchup, it's not like it pays off every time, because it enters play exerted, and if they see that happening, maybe they just drop an Aladdin, and that's a very high value item to get rid of just the turn after when the Aladdin quests.
True. I was able to test it a little bit in Blue Steel, actually, and ultimately, I thought it was just okay. I think it's a cool card to have. Like, if Lorcana had sideboards, I'd probably add it in my sideboard for Green Steel. Would I have been comfortable main decking it on the day? I'm not totally sure, but it did ultimately work out for our player here that was able to make top 4 with that deck. The 3 versus 4 how far ago is quite a dichotomy in the Lorcana community with the Ruby Sapphire players. It does seem to be the card that gets cut the most. I understand why, right? It is uninkable. It is a 4-cost uninkable at that, but I don't know why. That's the first card people always cut. They always cut the 1 half Argo. You always see 3 half Argos. And I think that is, in my opinion, and I have been a person that's cut that to 3 in the past, I think it is a 4F card. I think it's one of the most powerful cards in Ruby Sapphire.
Yes, I hate seeing that at a 3 count. I think it's really core to what the deck wants to do.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, this is looking at the top 4 list, this is probably my favorite list. This and, of course, Ruby Amethyst, which will be coming up on next. I think this list is very well positioned into the set, the rest of the set 4 metagame, which will ultimately be set championships coming here in July. This is the list that I'm looking at the most. This and Ruby Amethyst, which let's hop over to now. So our last list here is Ruby Amethyst. We see some really cool additions, things I've seen showing up on ladder. Main one being the Magic Broom. The rest of the cards in here are core. And when I say core, it's still a pretty debated topic, right? Because are you playing the Cuscos? Are you playing Chernobog's Followers? Are you playing the 1/3s? And now we have the Magic Broom as the new 1-drop. It sounds like it's no big deal, but that's a very contentious subject when you come to Ruby Amethyst. Ruby Amethyst is a deck where the deck kind of builds itself, and then these last sort of 8 to 12 slots and the exact number of cards you have in those slots are super important. So let's talk about some of these standouts here for this list. We have 2 Madame Medusa, not 4. I mean, 4 shows up pretty often. We have 2. I think that's the biggest deviation from maybe some standard lists. We also have 3 Be Prepared. You see some Ruby Amethyst lists on 2 Be Prepared, some on 4. I mean, those are the most contentious cards for me. And then, of course, this Magic Broom as the 1-drop that can sort of cantrip itself. If we talk about Ruby Amethyst as a deck that evolved from set 3 to set 4, the biggest changes in that deck are the Flynn Rider that gains 3 lore at 2 cost, and the Sisu. Those cards are extremely powerful. So Ruby Amethyst is a deck that pivots between being an aggressive deck and being a very control and card advantage based deck. And what separates good from bad Ruby Amethyst players is knowing when to play for card advantage and when to play for aggression. Your equity to be an aggressive deck as a Ruby Amethyst player has gone up drastically with the addition of Flynn Rider and Sisu. Your matchup into Ruby Sapphire, specifically a matchup that I would have considered to be poor in set 3, is now quite good because you can do things like 1-drop, 2-drop Flynn, 3-drop Sisu, 4-drop Castle, and good luck to your Ruby Sapphire opponent dealing with that. What are your thoughts on Ruby Amethyst?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly good deck. It is some, to me. I think it struggles against Emerald Steel, which is a tough pill to swallow. But as you said, difference between great and good Ruby Amethyst players is really being able to be flexible in your game plans and recognizing when to go for which one. And this Ruby Amethyst was piloted by Kurt Spies. Hope I'm not butchering the name. And they were on stream 3 times, and they totally showed that they were able to do that. Completely outvaluing a Sapphire Steel. At least in one game for sure, Ruby Sapphire. I think in another game also Sapphire Steel. And in other games just being really, really aggressive and winning that way. So I think their recognition and skill really showed in those top matches and brought them to this point.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I want to point out is we do have a bit of a visual bug on one card here. It just shows 1 Queen's Castle. There's, in fact, 4 Queen's Castle in the list. I mean, I think this list looks great. It's interesting that they went down to the 3 Madam M Snake, which is, I think it's totally fine. It's just how you ride to that exact number, I think is really interesting. It's probably, if I was going to look at the top 4 list of Chicago and say, what am I going to play on ladder, or what would I bring to locals tomorrow? It's either going to be that Sapphire Ruby or this Ruby Amethyst. I think this Ruby Amethyst deck, actually in lead up to the tournament wasn't getting enough recognition, and we were hesitant to put in S tier. It was more like I felt like I was lobbying for it because I'm super biased, and I snuck it up in there, but it performed really well on the day, and I think it's such a good deck. A lot of people were asking the question around Ruby Amethyst, like, can it scale into set 4? Because set 4, let's be real. In Lorcana, we saw this massive jump in power. Like the difference between the top decks and the medium decks or mid decks is huge right now. Way more than set 3. And it's like, can Ruby Amethyst scale into that metagame? And a lot of people, including myself, were maybe not. Nevertheless, Ruby Amethyst is here. It's doing the same thing as it was doing before, and its aggressive package is much, much, much more powerful. So I think it's a fantastic list. If you're a sort of mid-range player and I don't know, you like some controlling aspect, Ruby Amethyst just is that deck. It kind of just does a lot, everything, right? It draws cards, it plays aggressive, it clears the board, and it interacts. It's kind of if you played Magic, like the Jund of Lorcana.
I think the biggest advantage it's really gotten is it used against a very good Ruby Sapphire player in set 3. It used to be a bad matchup against Ruby Sapphire. And I think that has changed. I think that is now a favorable matchup for you, and there's multiple reasons. One, Ruby Sapphire is worse against Castle. 2, you have this aggressive curve of 1-drop Flynn, Sisu, Castle. That's especially on the play is extremely hard to deal with for Ruby Sapphire. But so, okay, you can gain more lore early, but what if they stabilize? Also, on top of that, you can slow down their game plan a good bit more because now you have, with the B King Undisputed, you have efficient answers to maybe the Tama Tower.
Yep.
You have more answers to the Flavasham before they draw 4 cards of those. So they gain more lore early. Ruby Sapphire is worse against Castle, and you can slow them down more with Brawls and King Undisputed, which has suddenly turned this matchup into a good matchup.
Yeah, I think your matchup against Ruby Sapphire is drastically better. Like it's so much better. Anyway, let's extrapolate this to set championships because that's coming up in July. That's sort of the next thing on everybody's calendar. Obviously, there's this tournament in Europe that's coming up that you will be attending. But if you were looking towards set championships right now, looking to get some of those Ursula promos, what deck would you be leaning towards and why? Out of the top 4, because this top 4 is, I mean, we have 4 decks to pick from. Obviously, Blue Steel isn't represented up here, and that's probably in contention for a deck you could play. But let's just talk about the top 4 decks. Which one would you be leaning towards?
Me personally, maybe I would still stick to Ruby Sapphire, but I think in general, for like the wider range of players, Emerald Steel is probably just a very good shout. Where this deck is also If you don't think about the money, it's very easy to pick up.
Yeah. The mulligan is tough. It is a innocuously complex deck in the terms of, mulligan correctly and knowing your game plans, but outside of that, the sort of turn to turn complexity is a little bit easier. Also, I think it's weird because when we talk about green steel, all of the cards in green steel are not super powerful, but 25% or 30% ish of the deck is like some of the most broken cards in the game. Yeah, and it just does that every single time. Yeah, and Diablo is probably the most meta working card in Lorcana. It's just an absolute must answer as soon as it comes down, or the game is just over. It feels like. Anyway,
What would you play in set champs?
I think that so. I'm between Ruby Sapphire and Ruby Amethyst for sure. At this point, I would probably lean towards Ruby Amethyst, but it also depends on the format. And you're like, oh, it depends on the format. Not for why you think. Depends on the format because if it's best of 3 at a local set championships with players of varying skill and experience, I don't enjoy playing Ruby Sapphire because it can be hard to finish games and I will get unintentional draws when I don't need to. I also feel like, and I always tell Moyen to not say this, but I will say this, my personal statistics in the Ruby Amethyst mirror are very good, and there's a lot of Ruby Amethyst players. So, yeah, when that gets closer to 50%, I'll probably consider other decks, but it is not there right now. So yeah, I do think that set championships is looking to be super fun. I think that it will be relatively diverse, not as diverse as set 3 in terms of like the amount of decks that will show up to the tournament, but I think it will be diverse in terms of the decks that are actually making it in the top 8. I think we'll see a lot of our S tier decks and maybe some of our A tier and B tier decks making it in the top 8s. And I think it's going to be a really good set championships. I'm really excited for it. Hopefully we can farm some promos again because that was super fun. Anyway, congratulations to everybody that was able to compete in Chicago. Congratulations to our top 8 and ultimately our winner on Green Steel. We'll be looking forward to that tournament in Germany. I'm not going to say the name of the location. I am joined by a German. Where, for people who don't know, how do you say it?
Bochum.
Bochum. Good luck to everybody
Yeah, that was
competing.
pretty good. That was actually very good.
Yeah. Good luck to everybody competing there. We'll keep our eyes out for that. We'll do a tier list prior to that. Maybe not do a tier list because it's not going to change too much, but we'll definitely be breaking down the list. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe, hit like on the video. We do have a weekly podcast that releases every single Friday. We have all types of different creators come on there. People like Savige, Spessy, Raven, etc. And we talk about everything Lorcana, up-to-date stuff in regards to metagame, break down our list, what we're playing, all that good stuff. So be sure to subscribe if you're interested in that. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.